So the first half of this unit was all about monopolistic competition. Now we're going to change and talk about oligopolies and what they are. Okay, so I want to start off with the same graphic that I've shown you guys several times, right? We have 4 different market structures. If we're trying to decide what market structure it is, the first question we ask is what's the number of firms in the market, right? 1 is a monopoly, a few is an oligopoly, many is either perfect competition or monopolistic competition, and then that depends on whether or not they're differentiated products or identical products. So let's begin by talking about oligopolies, okay? So the primary characteristic of an oligopoly is the fact that it's a market with only a few firms. Now, the word few, that's kind of an arbitrary or, kind of a gray word to use, right? Like, what does that mean? What is a few, right? So let's get into a little bit about the math behind how we figure that out. All right, so if we're trying to decide whether or not a market is an oligopoly, then we can look at 2 different measurements. Okay, we can look at what's called the concentration ratio, which is actually that definition that's not the definition of concentration ratio. Concentration ratio is just the percentage of total output that's produced by a company. Okay, the percentage of total output that's produced by a company. So say, for example, my company is a really big company. It produces 25% of the total output of the overall market. Well, then my concentration ratio would be 25%. Now, if the 4 largest firms combined control 40% or more of the market, then it's considered to be an oligopoly. So that's the key part, right? If the 4 biggest companies control 40% or more of a market, it's officially considered to be an oligopoly. All right? Now, here's the thing with that. You could have a market where, say, the 4 biggest companies control like 80% of the market, and then the rest of the market is split between maybe only like 1 or 2 other companies, right? Or you could have a market where, say, the 4 biggest control 40%, and then the other 60% is split between like 20 or 30 other companies. Well, in that case, one oligopoly, the first example I gave you, right? That's a really concentrated market. It's an oligopoly that's actually very close to a monopoly. Whereas that second example I gave you is an oligopoly, but that's much closer to monopolistic competition. So those 2 markets might give you like some different outcomes based on the fact that one has a lot more competition than the other. So we use this other thing called the Herfindahl index to help us get a little bit closer look at how concentrated the market actually is. So the Herfindahl index, it looks like a really complicated formula, but it's actually very simple. All you do is take each company's concentration ratio and square it and add it to the next company, okay? And so on and so on and so on. So you take each concentration ratio for each company, you square each concentration ratio, and then you add them all together. Now, the biggest possible Herfindahl index you could get, the biggest possible value you could get, would be a company that controls 100% of the market, which would be a monopoly. So that'd be a 100 squared. So that answer is 10,000. 10,000 is the largest possible Herfindahl index value you could get. So the closer your Herfindahl index gets to 10,000, the closer the market looks to a monopoly. So let me give you guys just like a simple little example here, right? So say I have one market that has like, let's say it's like, all right, so the biggest company controls 25%. The biggest concentration ratio is 25%. So that's the first company. And then the second company also controls 25% of the market. So that's 25 squared as well. And then the third company controls maybe 20% of the market. Okay, so that'd be 20% squared. And then the fourth company controls, say, 10%. So it'd be 10% squared. The next one controls 10%, so 10% squared again. And then that's 50 plus 20 is 70, 80, 90. And then a third company controls 5%, and a fourth company controls 5%. All right? So if we added all of this together, right, okay, so it'd be 25 squared, okay, which is 625, so 625 plus 625 plus 20 squared, which is 400, so plus 400 plus 10 squared, which is 100, plus 100, plus 25 plus 25. Okay, so that's 625 plus 625 plus 400 plus 100 plus 100 plus 25 plus 25. Okay, so that's a total of 1900. So that's the Herfindahl index for this right here is the Herfindahl index for that company, right? Or for that market. Now let's say there's another market out there where the biggest company is 10%, and there's 4 companies that are like that. So 10% plus 10% squared plus 10% squared plus 10% squared. Okay, plus say that let's say that there's like 6 companies that are like this. So 10% squared, 10% squared. Okay, so that's the 6 biggest companies, and then we'll do another one, so I don't have to like do so much math here, right? So that, and then you have the next, so that's 70% of the market right there. Okay, and then the other 30% is split between a bunch of companies that own 5%. So 5 squared plus 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 5 plus 5. Okay, so actually, wait, sorry, 105. So there we go. All right, so if I added all that together, right, this would be 100, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it'd be 100 times 7, so that's 700. All right, plus all of these squared, so 25 plus 25 plus 25 and so on. So 25 times 6 plus 25 times 6, which is 150. So you have 700 plus 150 is a total of 850, right? So which market is more concentrated? Well, this market is much more concentrated, right? It has fewer firms in it. They hold more of the market in control, and then this market has many smaller firms, right? So this market is closer to an oligopoly or a monopoly than this market is. This market is much more competitive. So the lower number means more competitive. Higher number means less competitive, right? So that's the Herfindahl index, all right? Now, because of the way that this market is set up, there's always this tension between cooperation and self-interest, because when you have a small number of firms competing against each other, it's very easy for those firms to get together and try to like take some steps to say like, hey, instead of us competing against each other, why don't we like all raise our price at the same time and try and get more money out of our customers, but not lose any customers if we all raise it at the same time. So there's that incentive to want to try and do that. But here's the problem. So suppose like 2 companies get together and they decide to raise their prices at the same time. Well, now each company individually has an incentive to lower the price to try to steal the other company's customers. So there's always that tension between cooperation and competition in this kind of a market. All right. So what are the So back to characteristics, right? Few sellers offering similar or identical products. Doesn't matter if they're differentiated or not. Okay, they're interdependent firms. That is a key term there, guys. Anytime you see interdependence, think oligopolies. Okay, as opposed to independence. In perfect competition, firms are independent of each other. They're not paying attention to what each firm does. But in an oligopolistic setting, they're interdependent. Each company is paying a lot of attention to what the other company does. And again, they're better off cooperating, right? But then that creates that incentive to try to like to lower the price and steal each other's customers. Okay. Now we're gonna look at a duopoly mostly in this unit. When we look at oligopolies, a duo, the prefix duo means 2, right? So a duopoly is like the simplest form of an oligopoly. It's 2 sellers. You don't have to know the definition of duopoly or anything, but that's what we're mostly going to look at in this unit. Now, the two companies, they have an incentive, right, to get together and try and not compete with each other. There's a name for that. That's called collusion. Okay, so collusion is when firms agree not to compete with each other, basically. And when they collude, what they're creating is a cartel. Okay, so collusion is like the act of agreeing not to compete with each other. A cartel is what's formed when they make that agreement. All right. Like I said before, they want to try and agree not to compete with each other. Okay. But and if they, let me say one other thing about that. If they decide to not compete with each other, what are they doing then? Well, essentially, there's no competition, so they're acting like a monopoly, right? But often this is not possible for a lot of different reasons. Number one, it's highly illegal. Okay, but again, number two, there's that incentive that once you create the agreement, there's a big incentive to break that agreement. We're going to talk more about that tomorrow when we get into game theory. All right. Antitrust laws make this stuff illegal, and if you get caught doing it, you get in a lot of trouble. You get fined a ton of money. But yeah, the antitrust laws are supposed to prevent that. Okay, so when we talk about antitrust laws, remember we discussed that back with monopolies, like the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Clayton Act, stuff like that. So yeah, that's what they're trying to do there. Okay, now think about when we did that list, the order of market structures. You have perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopolies, and then monopolies. So oligopolies fall between monopolistic competition and monopolies. So the outcomes are going to fall in between those. So what we're going to see is that the quantity produced by an oligopoly is going to be less than what is produced by a monopoly, right? Because there's more competitors. But it's going to be, it's going to be greater than what's produced by a monopoly. An oligopoly output will be greater than what's produced by a monopoly, but it'll be less than what's produced by a competition, by a market with competition. So like monopolistic or perfect competition. Okay? The price is going to be in between as well, right? So generally speaking, the price is going to be less than what a monopoly would price at, but it's going to be greater than what perfectly or monopolistically competitive firms price at. Okay? So to kind of wrap all this up, a couple of things to kind of discuss, right? So possible outcomes if oligopoly firms pursue their own self-interest, right? Again, they're better off not competing with each other, right? And remember that the output's going to be greater than a monopoly, but it's going to be less than competition. Prices are going to be lower than a monopoly, but greater than competition. And the profits are generally going to be lower than monopoly profits, but probably greater than competition profits. Okay? Also, too, understand something, right? The firms, if they want to try to agree to not produce as much, right? They want to collude with each other. Okay, as more firms enter into this market, that's going to make it harder and harder for that to happen. Okay, so as more firms join the market, it's going to be harder and harder to collude because now you've got to try to hold that agreement among more firms, and that's going to be much, much more difficult to do. But as firms enter, right, that's going to increase the output and it's going to lower the price. Okay, so in other words, as more firms enter into an oligopolistic market, it's going to make the market look more and more like a monopolistically competitive market or perfectly competitive market. So to wrap this up, as the number of sellers in the oligopoly grows, the oligopolistic market looks more and more like perfect competition or monopolistic competition, right? That price is going to get closer and closer to marginal cost. In other words, we're going to get more and more efficient, right? We're going to get closer and closer to the socially efficient output level. All right. And then, so that's it. That's the basics of oligopolies. And the next video, we'll talk about a specific outcome for oligopolies, which is game theory.